Hello and welcome back to another episode of Tales and Tactics, Rules as Written, the show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Join us as we dive into games you know and may never have heard of. And of course, we are back after a little break, and I am here, Max, with my host, Troy, and of course, behind the scenes, somewhere lurking and making it all sound good, is our producer, Jay. Today's episode, we're going back in time to the early 70s for the first science fiction role-playing game, so far as we know, at least in publisher terms, Metamorphosis Alpha. So, what can we say about that one? What were your feelings just going through the book?
This is a hard read because of its format and layout, but once you get through that, the actual content of the book is extremely interesting. There's ideas here that are not replicated in many other games. Even though this is such an early foundational title, it is doing things that a lot of other games didn't follow up on in the same way that you see them developed here.
Yeah, it has a lot of things that I've heard people talking about in role-playing as a philosophical concept through other YouTube channels and the like, that are, I guess because it's such an early game, and this is the wrong way to put this, but it doesn't know you can't do that.
Exactly, no.
And that's not to say that you shouldn't do that or that that's the wrong way, but it comes from I don't want to say a naive point of view, but from a blank enough slate that it's suggesting things that, in fact, we don't see almost at all in a lot of games. So let's get into where this thing comes from and what it's all about.
Mm-hmm.
So the game is designed by James M. Ward, published through TSR in 1976. So that's I don't know if that's exactly 1 year. It could be in a matter of months. But Traveler, the sci-fi game that we usually associate role-playing with, is the following year, or at least in some comparable amount of time. It basically is influenced under the non-canonical structure, or I will call it the disputed structure of original Dungeons and Dragons. And if you read a book like The Elusive Shift, it'll explain why the sort of vagueness around what a role-playing game is and how people didn't really know. There was no consensus on how the game would actually be played.
Right.
And as I said, it predates Traveler, and it combines a lot of interesting elements of classic sci-fi, sort of golden age sci-fi, with things like radiation causing mutations. There's an idea of survival in space and other kinds of elements, but it all takes place on and this is a sci-fi concept, a generation starship. So this is the idea that came out. I'm not even sure who first came up with the idea, but I know that Robert Heinlein's Orphans of the Sky definitely is a big example of, and possibly one of the influences on this game, of the idea that before the idea of warp travel, the ability to travel faster than light, people first settled on the concept, maybe not first settled, but there was a more believable version of long-distance space travel where people would have to spend multiple generations traveling between stars.
This is also something that Brian Aldiss talks about in Non-Stop, his novel about a generation ship where the inhabitants, I guess, forget where they come from, their origin and purpose, and then they start to live a little bit different amongst the technology that they at one time had an understanding of that they do not now.
Yeah, and I think the Aldiss novel is probably more of an influence on this book because it talks about how, like, the human species evolves in, like, different branches.
Right.
So, not to spoil that story, but the protagonists live in a primitive society inside one of the ships, eventually discover that they're in a ship, and then discover, so that they keep showing these giants that show up all the time. And it turns out that the giants are actually normal-sized humans, and the protagonist and his tribe have actually evolved to be much, much smaller.
That's so interesting. Like, take that.
Yeah, I know. It's like, sorry if I ruined a twist for a book that's been out since like 1958. Anyway, but this game takes that concept and then goes hog wild with it. Like X-Men like mutations.
Yes.
Across the board. And it does that in a very weird way that we'll get into later.
But yeah, this game, it pioneers the the referee-driven, free-form, dynamic game experience. It's like entirely about exploration and the way that you push against the world and the world then pushes back against you through the referee.
Yeah, and the exploration aspect of that, I think, is interesting because it's not just like the way that we would think about exploring like in a role-playing game where, I'm going to go over that hill and see what's over there. That is definitely a part of it.
Yeah.
But also the idea of lost technology and trying to understand. And this is maybe one of the interesting quirks of this game, that when we get into the actual system and what it does and doesn't do, it'll really show off some of those more interesting aspects.
So to talk about like this as a book, it's not a book that you would expect it to be. We're used to a certain vault page count, right? And especially coming from this earlier era of role-playing games.
Mm-hmm.
This is 35 pages. However, the font is tiny. Yeah, it's not like a poorly written. It's not hard to understand in that capacity. It's just that it is a...
It's not Gygaxian by any stretch.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't have this obtuseness. It's actually fairly easy to read, though the order in which things are presented is a little strange.
Yeah, I'll agree. And yes, it was 2-column printing, tiny font, strange order, but clarity in the text. So it's worth engaging with if this is the type of science fiction that moves you. This kind of exotic, esoteric, freeform. I'm going to use the word freaky because I think it applies, and that it also has another weird thing I just want to defer to before we get more into like the game.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily tell you what dice to roll.
Yeah. So in the actual book, they have a list of, it actually goes ahead and explains like what you'll need to play the game.
Yeah,
and it does it in a very what I thought was funny, but is dead serious. So on the suggested additional equipment section, page 3, it has first listed random number generator. Random numbers can be generated by means of a small electronic calculator. Mr. Ward, I want to know what calculator in 1976 can generate authentic random numbers.
Yeah.
Is this like some Texas Instrument masterwork computer that like maybe 10 people have, all of which are accountants?
It's a Ford. It's just a giant, like, huge brick of a car in your driveway.
Yeah, I know, right? Like I imagine, like, it's probably, it could be handheld. Like 70s technology isn't that backward, but like, how common would that even be? Then after listing that, he also suggests using cards, dice, chits in a bag.
Classic.
It's interesting, and we'll see this throughout the rest of the rules, that like instead of saying in like a modern game where you would say 3d6, it's giving you specific instructions as to like, oh, your damage will be 3 6-sided dice. Instead, he'll write it as 3 to 18, and then you'll have to figure out what method of generation will get you between 3 and 18. That, of course, not making the point that rolling 3 6-sided dice actually has different probability, but that isn't mentioned at all.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to be so easy to work with. Like, oh, don't worry, you tell me what random number generator you're going to use. But it's like, in writing in that way, it's incredibly hard to know what any of the rules mean until you decipher, like, oh, this is a 3-6 roll. Cool.
Yeah.
But
right.
like, just looking over this the first time, everything felt a little bit arcane to me.
Yeah. It's strangely unspecific and super specific at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that is in specific. Sorry, I used the word specific too many times. Some of this is in aid of how the game is intended to be played.
Right.
Which I think is the unique selling point of this.
Mm-hmm.
But in a lot of cases, it's also, I think it's what you were saying, it's trying to be more flexible. But right after this random number generation item, the next item on that list is polyhedra multi-sided dice, multi-sided in parentheses. And a set of polyhedra dice, 4, 8, 12, and 20 sides, which are the standard ones for the time. I think he even makes mention of D100s, but in the older school 2 20s, with each 20 only going to 10 twice. So he's clearly aware of all the conventions up until this time, but there's this strange thing where it's like, yeah, use anything to generate random numbers. Use dice to generate random numbers. What?
And what's the last one, or one of the last ones?
Oh, yeah. So, like, you have all the other things. As sort of, he has graph paper, hex paper, sheet protectors. That's specific, but definitely a useful thing. Notebooks, of course, pencil, paper, and imagination.
Oh, yes, the key ingredient. Which is funny, just because, like, the only way that these words on the page are making it into your consciousness is through imagination. So it's just weird that you'd like, oh, and and don't forget to keep breathing while you play this game. That also is important. Like, it's just weird.
I mean, I think for the era that it was created, I think that sort of makes sense because people don't really know what a role-playing game is, and this is Ward's attempt to codify, at least in his interpretation, of the nature of this game. So even though that seems silly to us, it is sort of a clue to what the game is actually about.
That's a good point.
Yeah, and then I think the final fun one is one very patient referee.
Yeah.
And players. The more the merrier. And I know in principle, yes, but I want to push back on if you're introducing this concept to somebody, it probably would have been better to have a number between 2 and 6.
Yeah, instead of just saying like get a whole dinner party in here. Like, yeah, it's true.
And I'm not saying you can't do that. And to be fair, the game I hesitate to call it rules light, but it is definitely less burdensome than say AD&D would be, or will be in context to this. But there's still a whole thing about managing people at a table. And to be fair, I think you would have more of a captive audience, and I'm just guessing this, in mid-70s, who are used to playing like hex and counter war games,
right?
Very high detail strategy games. I mean, you pick up any other rule book at this time, and if anything, this is probably a smoother ride than managing a lot of those things.
Well, 100%, right? It's like 35 pages. That's pretty relaxed relative to some of the things out there, like Gettysburg or whatever.
Yeah, well, exactly, right? And that's a fairly old game by the time this comes out.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Now we're going to get into the guts of this thing. So, Troy, you were having fun making characters or going through that process.
Yeah, it's really cool. Like, the character creation this is not the game of character creation, but it is a game where there are such satisfying directions you can go. And that's what I was kind of referring to earlier when I said, like, there's not really a lot of games that follow this precedent, because there are some seriously interesting builds that you can go with. And I don't mean to say builds like, I use that term as a convenience, not really like it's a game that you optimize, because you literally cannot. It's a 3d6 down the line, and you have a few different playable types of characters that you can be. First off, you have humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
The humans themselves are, they have basic attributes. They're in settlements. They use supplies. They have some, reliance on tools. And think of them as like a hunter-gatherer kind of primitive society in many respects, right? You then have mutated humans. And this is what Max had referred to as X-Men characters, right? Because they're not mutated in the same, they can be sort of, but in the same way as like a warp mutated person would be from like a Warhammer setting, for example.
Mm-hmm.
These guys are more like lasers out of their eyes in a cool way.
Yeah, there's certainly a kind of more of a optimistic sci-fi flavor, even though in a lot of ways this is, I don't know if I call it a post-apocalyptic setting, but it is sort of like that.
It kind of is. Because you're dealing with the fallout of what was. You know what I mean? And that, to me, kind of helps define what a post-apocalyptic setting is. But this is kind of clever because it's a localized apocalypse, right? It's like it's a is only a specific place, which is this vessel. I do want to mention my favorite type of playable character in this game. These are the guys that, to me, make this so interesting, is that you can be an intelligent creature. And that can be anything from a plant to an animal to some type of hybrid mutated thing that you want to engage with that does not fit either a human or a mutated human. I was working with a psychic tiger who had like enhanced defensive skin and claws that were mutatedly good. It was awesome. And I was so interested. I did name them Scar because, I mean, like, come on. The guy had a scar and a black mane to his fur. So I was like, of course, this is how this is going. But the inclusion of such a unique type of character is really what helped get me on board with this game and some of the cool things you can do with it, right? And we did allude, or I did say, is a 3d6 down the line, right? You have your core attributes, and Max, if you want to run us through those, that'd be great.
Yeah, so these are, some are going to seem familiar, and some of them are going to be a little different, specific to the setting. And I think that the thing to keep in mind here is what's not included, and I'll get to that when I finish this. So we've got radiation resistance. And so radiation plays an important role in the game, as it's partly why mutations exist. It's not scientifically accurate, but for the purposes of fiction, obviously, it's a precedent there.
It's fantastic radiation, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so radiation resistance determines how much you can resist negative effects of radiation. Then you've got mental resistance. So basically measures the defense against mental attacks or other sort of psychic influences, not necessarily psychic in a supernatural sense. It could also be things like morale or your ability to handle yourself under stress.
Mm-hmm.
You've got dexterity, which governs agility and reflexes and is the predominant attribute for hitting with weapons. It doesn't matter what kind.
Yes, that's something to wrap your head around in combat, is you want dexterity. And that's why a tiger monster felt really natural, because they would be very dexterous. They're a feline, so let's go.
Hopefully if you rolled high enough. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that, of course, being the key. I just rolled 18s the whole time. I don't know what you're talking about, but.
Yeah, right. So the next one up is Constitution. And in this case, Constitution just is hit points. There's no translation of that. When you take damage, you take it to your Constitution when you run out. When you hit 0, as so traditional with all older Dungeons and Dragons and other related games, you dead.
Yeah. There's no like 5 rolls to stop your beloved character from dying. You're just dead.
But considering how easy it is to roll up a character in this game, I'm not sweating it that hard.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's fun to create the characters here. I mean, it's almost like this game is so specifically about like how long can you last, more than it is about what is the great journey you will accomplish, you know?
Yeah, I like to think of mechanics and games kind of functioning between, and I'm going to use video games as an example of this. So they should either feel like an immersive sim where your character is significant enough and there's a lot of fallbacks and strategies that you can keep yourself from dying, but effectively you're pretty robust if you play smart. The main point of that is there's a lot of detail that goes into your character. There's a lot of build that goes in your character. On the other side, you can also have an RPG that plays more like a roguelike, which is death is really, really easily a possibility to you.
Yes.
But getting into a new game is like instantaneous. You don't want to have the high lethality. Well, okay, you can have the high lethality with the detail, but you have to understand how much that ratchets up the stakes.
Yes, exactly. Like that's like a Legend of the Five Rings, for example, right?
Yeah.
But like I would say like a Dungeon Crawl Classics is closer to the Metamorphosis Alpha, where it's like, ooh, your guy's probably going to die. But it's not bad to make a new one, and it's fun. And you kind of want to see the new avenues. that you can explore with a new character.
Yeah, Advanced Fighting Fantasy is another, like most rules light games have the advantage of being like, yeah, kill me off. I'll just now I'm the sidekick, and that's the difference. Like, you don't want to die, obviously, but
Max 2025. You don't want to die, obviously. You get your quote of the year out.
It takes the sting out of it when you know that you can make up a new character.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, hopefully the death was satisfying and it wasn't some
wasn't a spike trap. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, sometimes that's funny. To be fair, there are games that take those things and twist them. Like Paranoia does a good job of making pointless and stupid deaths actually fun.
Paranoia is a distant cousin of this game too, in a weird way.
Yeah, actually, there's a Paranoia module that effectively turns your Paranoia game into a Metamorphosis Alpha game.
Oh, wow.
I don't remember what it's called. It's an older edition, but yeah, it's got that thing where it's like, what if Alpha Complex was a spaceship and the people on it didn't know it was a spaceship,
right?
And it's just as broken as Alpha Complex. Okay, have fun with that.
Yeah, that's cool.
But anyway, digressions aside, so Constitution is health, and it also is some indicator of endurance, if you want to use it that way. Strength. So determines physical power. Weirdly, this doesn't get a lot of description in a lot of places. It can be used as a way to augment damage to a certain degree, but it doesn't really give a specific way to do that. And I think it also has something to do with how much you can lift and carry. And I think that's more about what it's supposed to cover.
That's what I understood.
Yeah. Which is important when we get into what I think is the spirit of this game. And then finally, we got leadership potential, which is a humans only thing. So that makes true humans unique in the sense that they can negotiate, which apparently mutant humans and intelligent creatures just distrustful of each other.
Yeah. That kind of like that I don't know, but like when I think about it as a game mechanic, like that's why baseline humans are interesting, because of leadership potential, right? It gives them like a social superpower that the mutations don't represent and that being an intelligent creature doesn't represent. But it also doesn't necessarily make sense in the way that many other decisions in this game make sense. Feels like that's kind of an outwardly gamist decision.
Yeah. And that's that area where I talk about how it's, we were mentioning it was like a rules light, but not a rules light. Like it has these little wrinkles in it that aren't, they're not consistent. Like it feels like somebody's trying to feel out, it's the blind man and the elephant kind of thing, but with role-playing games.
Yeah.
Where you're not entirely sure what it is, but you think it's this, and so you call it as such. So one thing that you'll notice that's absent from this list is any kind of fixed, I don't know what to call it, deductive.
Like a mental, right?
Attribute. Well, there's mental resistance, and I guess leadership could be determined as a kind of mental ability, but there's no deductive or contemplative thing. Like there's no intelligence, like you were saying. There's certain faculties of intelligence in role-playing games, especially modern ones. But even if you go to like AD&D in the way that it describes intelligence and what that's used for, are more specific. And I don't think that's an omission based on looking at the rest of the game. Or I don't think that omission is, how would I say? It's not an accidental omission. Because the impression that I get from but like from reading this book and how it's played is that a lot of it, and this is going to sound weird and alien to people who are used to playing role-playing games in a particular way, especially modern ones, 5e, and I don't know, any other popular game, probably since the 90s or even the late 80s, is that this game seems to suggest that a lot of it is the players figuring stuff out. And I think that's represented in the way that these attributes are listed.
That makes sense. Like, do you want to elaborate a little more with like an example or how that might play out in like the game? Like what does it mean if there's no deductive stat for you to roll against?
Okay. So I'll have to get into the character progression aspect of this, so we might as well get into that.
Yes.
So the other clue to how this game is played is that there is no mechanical statistic progression.
Right.
The stats that you roll are your stats for the entire game. There is no leveling system. There is no skill system. It is entirely all negotiable with the referee. That said, a lot of what the referee is sort of suggested to describe things is that if the players find let's say a laser pistol, they're not to describe it as a laser pistol because, and we didn't really get into the theming of this, but true humans, and I guess mutated humans and intelligent creatures, are basically cavemen in this spaceship, for lack of a better word. They have no context. I mean, when we get to the lore, we'll talk about exactly how the ship is structured, but it's basically broken up into different levels, some of them containing like jungles, like whole ecosystems. And the player's village or settlement or whatever starts in one of these places, and they have no context as to the fact that they're on a ship. Again, it's like Brian Aldiss's Non-Stop, where you're kind of living in a backward society. And so the way it sort of hints at how you interact with technology is that the referee will not describe it as a laser pistol. They'll describe it as a tube with a protrusion. There's a little ring with another thin hook-shaped protrusion inside of that ring. And you as a player have to go, that's a gun.
Mm-hmm. Like the deduction and the reasoning is all in your mind, not in imagined character's mind that you're resolving out through skills or dice checks or some other abstraction. Like it's your brain, and can you solve the riddle?
The only game that I can think that does this direct, like a modern game, I'm sure there are other games that have this, is actually the roguelike styled game Caves of Qud.
Oh, yes.
Where, depending on your character's intelligence, when they come across, and this is my favorite example, when you come across a folding chair, it's described as a series of metal tubes or an assemblage of metal tubes, because to somebody who doesn't know what a folding chair is, that would actually sort of describe it.
Yeah. I can see it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a super vague thing because obviously it has a flat part to sit on and a flat part for your back. But like at a glance, the overall look of it would look like a bunch of bent pipes. And that would also suggest you know what a pipe is. So the advancement in this game is your character going from knowing nothing but sticks and rocks to eventually figuring out how laser guns and hover sleds work.
And you don't learn that because of numbers, right? That's all like experience that you learn.
That's you as a player. And I imagine some of the fun of being a referee in this game is to kind of either describe something in a slightly different way on a different playthrough, or introduce an object that does the same thing but looks different.
Oh, yeah.
Like maybe laser guns in one playthrough are like Flash Gordon style, like, ray guns. And then maybe in another playthrough, they're more like Star Trek TNG phasers, where they're more like a TV remote.
Yeah.
So that, I think, that's how you get replayability. So the game is, when Ward says you need imagination, I honestly think that's understated, because a lot of the game is figuring, like the modern equivalent, the novel equivalent of this in modern RPGs is the idea of, the D&D party comes to this room and there's this thing on the wall, and then the GM gives them a handout, which is literally a puzzle that they have to assemble at the table.
Yeah.
That's close to this. In this case, it's still through dialogue and description, but the referee is encouraged to be as obtuse as possible from the point of view of the people, from the characters. But the reason I think there's no intelligence stat or no deductive attribute is because the players are the brain and the referee is their point of reference.
I think that adds a really interesting challenge to playing and refereeing this, right? In that you need to reorient your expectations around the puzzle solving.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes there's a certain joy in just like rolling dice to see problems get solved. And you're not going to do that. You're going to, well, I mean, you will in combat and other circumstances, of course, but in the predominant room-to-room encounters, right, where you're progressing through the Warden, the generation ship, right, that experience is going to be a lot on the players and the referee, like reasoning out and cooperating together to come to conclusions. And there is a very fun kind of like 2001 Space Odyssey thing of like, you're the monkeys, right? Like bashing to figure out like what the tools mean. And that's really cool. But it's interesting that this is such an early game because I feel like it asks a higher level of role playing than some other comparative titles.
Yeah. Also, good on you, Mr. Ward, for calling the primary setting the Warden.
That's funny.
Subtle. Very subtle. But no, that's good. It's more subtle than Gary Gygax writing Gygax into a dungeon map.
And I mean, Luke Skywalker, his name's in the name, right? They're all doing it.
Yeah. Like, it's, you know what? I got no problem with that. On that same point, and this is another thing that I thought was an interesting outcome of this. Mm-hmm. So because there's no level or skill-based progression in the game, and your stats, like your attributes don't change, your mutations don't change, there really isn't any suggestion of that. Progression in the game really comes from your equipment. This could be argued to be a third type as opposed to level-based, skill-based. There's also equipment-based. And there's some fun little caveats of that. So the idea is like, if I was fighting with a spear up until now, and then I suddenly get a vibroblade, that's me getting a level up.
Yeah.
But there's a fun little caveat to that, which is the vibroblade could break. And so that tension around progression is never resolved the way that like linear level-based games where, like, oh, we played a level 10 and then nothing's that interesting anymore because all the monsters are leveling with us.
Right.
But if there's no fixed leveling and it's entirely based on what you're carrying on you, also that makes strength significant because that's how much stuff you can carry. So you have to be smarter about what you take and what you don't take. The game also has survival mechanics. So you have to find food and water and that. And the ship provides some of that. But a lot of the suggestion is that some of those systems just aren't working the way they're supposed to.
Well, survival is the key ingredient to the exploration of this game. Mm-hmm. Because you go out and you find things. You press your luck as you try and go deeper into the biomes on the ship, right? But it's the survival element that provides that grit. And like there was something that you said when we were first talking about this game is, why are you in the dungeon? Because you live in it.
Yeah.
And in this game, like there's no going to the dungeon. You're always in it at all times. So the same survival principles of like, how far do I go down the corridors before I turn back to get to my resource point again? Like that's kind of always happening in this game.
Yeah. No, it's also interesting the way that it's broken up into levels, but those levels are also fixed. I mean, that's more about the setting itself.
But it does impact the game. Like it does. Like the different levels you go through are very thematically and like specifically content-wise in the game different from each other. Mm-hmm. So they'll provide different experiences depending on like what your origin point is. Like if you're going to play as a true human, you might start on, I think it's deck 14, which is the city deck.
Yeah.
And then it's like that leadership potential stat needs to be high because you're going to be interacting with and trading with and fighting with all these tribes and peoples. And it's a whole thing where if you're on like the jungle decks below that, then be a tiger man.
Yeah. Or, and whatever deck you end up starting on is really up to the up to the referee at that point. So from the mechanical aspects of the game, there's some interesting, I'll call them 70s-isms. For instance, the way that so the combat system is decidedly very simple. It has characters that have an armor class, which there's different descriptions given for each of those things. Characters and everything have armor class, and there's a chart that determines what each type of AC would represent. So there's not having anything, there's having like furs or something like that, then there's metal armor and so on. Additionally, weapons have a class as well. And what you do is there's a table that has the weapon class and the armor class. You find the intersecting points between your target and your attacker, and then that's the number you have to beat on a d20, which is, in the sense that you have the lookup table, definitely an older way of doing things. I can think of a lot of hex and counter games that work that way, where it uses essentially, you have to use a tool in order to determine it. It's not based on these accumulative modifiers, though it is sort of suggested that you could do that as well, because there are things that don't say that. I'll wait till I get into how ranged combat works, because that adds a level of complexity that's not that bad, but I certainly haven't seen that before.
Right.
And then each weapon has its damage type, and there's this inconsistency across the board as to like what is described as use 3 6-sided dice, or knock someone out between 3 and 18 turns. I'm like, those are the same thing.
For the most part, they are. Yeah, there are those little peculiarities in the language that will get ironed out as role-playing games go down the line, but you do see them here. I mean, there's still like good writing behind this, but yeah, there is some weirdness. One thing I want to hit back on from character creation is I did want to talk about how mutations are assigned, like how you get them.
Oh, sure.
Because you're going to roll for your number of physical and mental mutations on a D4. And these are the like the marvelous mutations kind of concept, right? Where like you're not going to have like, oh, I'm a fire skeleton or I'm a thrashing tentacle beast. You know, it's like, no, you're a cool hero person with your powers because you can telekinetically move objects up to 100 pounds, or you can read thoughts, you know, and maybe that's why you don't need leadership potential if you can read thoughts. That's a debate. But once you eclipse a certain number of mutations, you also can randomly acquire defects. These also do include physical deformities, right? But it's more like blindness. You know, like a physical impairment that you may have to overcome, right? Or it could represent also a mental condition. So these defects kind of come out of the mutations that you acquire, and you don't necessarily stop getting mutations in this game, right? There are occasions that can give you them in play through exposure to, well, basically radiation in a high amount, but there may be other referee-driven situations where that could also happen too.
Yeah, for sure. And I thought an interesting thing was that you roll for how many mutations you might get, but you get to pick them, as far as I can tell, between physical and mental ones. So, like, technically you can get extra limbs as a mutation. Like, you can get an extra arm, I think.
Yeah, or, well, you kind of like get like, that was something I added to Scar. Is Scar had my tiger had like 2 forelimbs, or sorry, 4 forelimbs.
Oh wow!
Just because it was cool. And I just picture like, what if Goro was a tiger?
Right.
Like there's something there. But yeah, you're right. And like it's more that I tend to think there's this like cosmic horror expectation to a lot of mutation in gaming. And this is sort of playing at the supers angle of it, which is fun and gives you a lot to do when you're doing a mutated human character, not a baseline or a true human. And then intelligent creatures also get mutations too. So they're the other, I mean, they're like crazy, but they're that template that starts so different. that then also can have these same mutations.
Yeah, for sure. And if anything, because they're not based on a human template, I don't want to say they're made of mutations because they're obviously based on something, but they're way off the beaten path for like a normal player character.
It's so cool to me that you can be these like wild concept characters, not just, oh, I'm a human who's good with a bow this time. You know, like you can be like a plant that has laser leaves. And
yeah, right. That's an actual thing.
Like, why would you want that? But there's a certain desire to push the character concepts that you can take into a game. And I think this title, Metamorphosis Alpha, really gives you that in like a really fun, tangible way. Like you'll see that in some of the games we'll talk about after this that took inspiration from this game, you know, like Mutant Crawl Classics and stuff. That also has like some pretty cool character potential. But it's just so cool in this game, so unique.
It's a lot more freeform. It's not as focused on game balance per se.
The dreaded balance, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think, like I've mentioned before in other episodes, like I think you should have enough balance that it's not egregiously unfair in some sense, but it's not that important, I think, overall.
Yeah.
Like there are certain points where it could be like way off, but like, I don't know. Role-playing games are, I mean, they can be competitive. There are competitive versions, like, you know, there's tournament games and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But that's not so much a thing anymore. I think that's more of an 80s, like an early 80s thing, if I think about it.
Yes.
Or a certain stream of late 70s play that had, and it was more to get people excited. And I think it was holding more to that idea of a conventional game. But even those games aren't that balanced. Like if you really look at it, a lot of it's the illusion of balance. And the referee is told that they can be arbitrary if they think that it makes the game flow better or if it tells a better story. This game, it clearly knows what it is, but it also doesn't really have any expectations hanging over it either. So it's refreshing to see that. That was my takeaway. So yeah, a lot of the game is action. So actions for solving problems using things like dexterity, strength, or figuring those things out for yourself and then making a decision based on that. Then there's combat, there's exploration, and some of those are resolved by rolling. Most of the things that we'd expect to resolve rolling dice, they do actually roll dice. It's more about determining what actions that you want to take, and your knowledge of those things is very, I don't think this is what you see is what you get, because obviously you're seeing it in your mind's eye, but that is effectively the spirit of that thing. It's like, oh, I know what the ref has told me.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously the ref's got enough, hopefully they have enough perspective to tell it to you in a way that your character would understand. I think that puts a lot on the person running the game.
It does.
To then think in those ways.
It does feel like a big ask in taking on the Starship Master, the referee role in this game, right? Because you have to manage the explanation and reveal of information to your players in such a specific way, in addition to running encounters, having challenges, helping characters grow and progress with maybe some type of narrative. Like, you know what I mean?
I think there's a higher ask with milieu control in this game because of the kind of fantasy that it is, and because of the lack of statistical rule support for that. It's really, a lot of it has to do with how you tell it.
Yeah, like it's so open to your interpretation on how to play this, which is to its strength again, because like, can you picture another game where you'd be a six-limbed tiger who's psychic? Like I can't. So I guess because there's that opportunity for such different elements to make up, for lack of a better term, a player character party, you know what I mean?
Yeah. So yeah, and then there's actually a decent amount given over to things like turn sequence and how long a round or a turn in combat is 10 seconds.
Yep.
Which is actually that's my preferred, because I like to do the the 10, 10, and 10. So 10 seconds, 10 minutes, 10 hours.
Oh, yes.
Right. So combat and then exploration and then travel.
Oh, okay. Yeah, totally. I understand what you mean by that.
Yeah. But sometimes I do travel in thirds or quarters. That is usually more intuitive. But it's not like the 6 seconds. I'm like, okay, that's odd.
Yeah, 6 seconds, like 6, but 10. But then, yeah, it's weird. It gets weird.
Yeah. And then weapons, I mean, they range everything from primitive implements to like futuristic, like ray guns and like plasma and probably everything in between. There's certainly enough references for things. A lot of it is high future and sort of scrap based Stone Age.
Yeah.
Not really Stone Age.
But there's not a huge, like what I would want to say is there's not a big middle ground in that you're going to find like an AR kind of machine gun. Like you won't.
That makes sense to me because if you had the tech for ray guns and stuff like that, those things they'd be antiques, effectively.
100%. It's why there's no muskets either, right? It's kind of like there's laser guns for sure and other like special, what's the protein disruptor? You know, there's like, there's crazy things out there. But then there's sticks and rocks.
And then another quirky thing about combat, and I wasn't 100% clear on this, so if someone can clear it up for me. But as I understand range combat to work is that you roll for your range attack using 2d6 on the range table. And then if successful with that, then you roll again for the actual hit for the attack on the AC as you would with a melee attack. And then you roll damage. I'm pretty sure that's what it was suggesting. Because different range bands have different difficulties, but they're not additive to the AC. They're actually a separate roll. It had a kind of, it made sense, but it also seemed a little cumbersome. And it also means that with range weapons, you have twice the chance to miss.
It kind of felt like the AC part was the locational check. You know, like, did you bounce it off the breastplate, sort of? But I know what you mean. It does mean you have to like gate your way through these steps with a range attack that you don't in melee. And maybe that's intentional because like maybe it's harder to use a ray gun if you never used a ballistic weapon in your life in any way, if you didn't even know that was a possibility. And then you pick something up and you're like, whoa, what was that? I just melted that door, 15 meters away. Whoa, what's happening? Like maybe there's just a learning curve.
It could be another interpretation of just how to balance range weapons.
Oh, yeah.
The idea that trying to hit something from afar based on how far it is no guarantee that it'll actually hit somewhere vital.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, I get it. And it's interesting to see it as a separate determination from actually like whether it passes the AC or not. And it's the thing is it wasn't cumbersome and it didn't make so little sense that I can't see myself using it. It didn't bother me that much, but I just thought it's one of those interesting sort of naive naive-ish rulings from like, it seems like a war game thing in a lot of ways. If that makes sense. Like, and I mean, when I mean a wargaming thing, I mean like an older wargame thing. Like that sounds like the way an artillery would strike in some hex encounter game.
Yeah, I know what you're pulling at.
Where like you want to see whether it hits the location, and then you want to see if it actually like penetrates the building. Yeah,
totally.
Right. So it has that level of granularity, which is why I'm hesitant to call it a rules light game, because even though it's simpler than in some ways D&D's rules or Chainmail's rules, it's still got these specific ways of handling things.
Yeah, it is very specific about certain edge cases are very defined, and then certain other ones are just left wide open for referee interpretation. And I think knowing the difference between those two wrinkles, right? Like when does Metamorphosis tell you how it works? That's what to me makes it not rules light, because you need to be deep enough in that this is a time there's a chart for this relative to this is a time it's my turn as the referee to define this.
Yeah.
I would say the one thing that we've talked about a few times, but I just want to like hammer home is this is like a survival exploration game. You're not going to the town to get a quest. I mean, you can do all this, obviously, right? It's your game. But I would say the number one thing you're doing is you're going out into this extremely alien and extremely unforgiving landscape that has what you need to survive, but is not going to give it to you. You're going to have to pry it. And that's going to be through cunning and through problem solving and through taking risks with these fragile characters. And that like survival exploration knife edge, that is the cool part of this game, like avoiding hazards, deciphering ancient tech, using the different attributes and statistical differences of your characters, but also the different mental differences between the players at the table to overcome some of the puzzles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And there's like a lot of trade interactions that are suggested. Like,
oh, that's true.
You'll find some other tribe, and that's where the true humans' like leadership ability can be used to negotiate. But I think some of that is also meant to just sort of be played out in character.
More so than there's supposed to be like a barter role. You're supposed to like talk it out. And yeah, there's the leadership potential stat, and you can for sure anchor your social interactions around that when appropriate. But it really feels like you're meant to just hash it out.
Yeah, so essentially, as a campaign, a lot of the game is just about going to a place, finding stuff. You might have like an overall quest, like I could very easily see like a Fallout 1 water chip kind of thing.
Oh,
where
yeah.
It's like, oh, this thing we don't understand isn't working anymore. You need to go out and find a way to fix it. And then I think a lot of it after that point is sort of side quests and going through and exploring and finding out what's going on.
I really got that same sense, like the whole water chip quest line, or like I always had pictured starting a campaign in a sci-fi post-apocalyptic game. We'll call it Numenera or something, right? That was effectively like a crashed version of the Warden on a planet.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But it's like the same thing.
Yeah. This is sort of like a crash generation ship.
Yeah.
Yep. And that would have a similar thing, though that would be more like an external dungeon that you would go to. But it would have a lot of the same vibe about it.
It would, right? But it's, yeah, the whole idea that it's this dungeon that you live within and you're interacting with your home environment, but it is still this dangerous puzzle zone to explore and uncover secrets about. And like even learning about the origin of the Warden itself can help you do more stuff in the game too.
Oh, for sure. So I think before we finally wrap up, we should touch on a little bit more about what the world is, because that is a big motivating factor of the game, which is what is the history of the Warden itself.
Yeah, because that's like a something that's really important to understand, because it's like in the future, I think it's the 23rd century or something to that effect. The starship Warden is built. It is built to carry 1.5 million colonists with 50,000 crew. And it's a starship. It's an interstellar vessel. So it's supposed to go a huge distance.
It carries all kinds of ecosystems and like complexity. It's basically like a flying miniature world.
It's an arc ship is another way to describe it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's just a generation starship, arc ship, flying biosystem.
Mm-hmm.
What's that? There's a sci-fi movie in the 70s that sort of Silent Running. It's a lot like the ship in that.
Okay.
But bigger. Yeah, and then sorry, you were saying
well, this big ship, it gets blasted by some type of radiation cloud. Maybe it's like a nebula or something like that. But it leads to a breakdown, a catastrophic series of mutations and societal collapse. And it could be thought of as almost like an EMP blast too to the ship, because it messes with so many components and changes things. And like there are robot guardians and AI aboard the ship. You could even play one if you want, because again, it's great. But it kind of sets them in some regards off kilter. So some of their programming gets disturbed or reinterpreted, and it creates all types of the adventuring grist that you need for a role-playing setting. And then your survivors of this, I guess we'll call it an apocalyptic event, They kind of become tribal societies. They forget technology.
There's a regression. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And they basically don't even know they're aboard a spaceship like we've hinted at before, right? They take this as the limit of their existence, and they're like, well, we can't go any further than here, and we don't even know that if we press the red button it would open a door and give us double the room. We don't even know that until we accidentally hit the red button, and then we're scared to go in that room because we don't know what it means.
I like to equate this to the episode of King of the Hill where they go to Japan, and at the end of the episode they find out that they're just in the foyer and there's an entire hotel room when they slide the door away.
Yeah.
And up until that point they're like sleeping in like drawers and stuff that are just happen to be in that front space.
It's exactly that.
That is the narrative premise behind your tribe. You're stuck on that floor and you don't even know there's a world beyond it. So yeah, the Warden's got 17 levels. Some of them are more industrial or some of them are more foresty. It's even suggested that there's like mountain ranges inside of it, which is wild. I don't really know how that works.
Yeah, it's insane. I don't get it, but it's cool though.
Yeah. And yeah, you're fighting mutated animals, angry tribes, killer robots. Like it's got all of the hallmarks of a fun, pulpy, exploring sci-fi, kind of post-apocalyptic, a few other things.
I was going to say it's super pulped out, like in all the really fun kind of page turning ways, right? Where you're like, how are we going to get out of this one? You know what I mean? It really does that. And you get your advanced technology, but you don't just get it for free. You have to rediscover it and master it and kind of take on this journey of like personal, well, kind of like character-based learning, right? But it's you that's learning. Is, you know, your referee gives you these cryptic descriptions of things and you have to decipher them. And I've played a game that wasn't Metamorphosis Alpha, but we were cowboys who found alien technology effectively in this game. And we set off a grenade without knowing what it was. And it was a disaster.
Yeah, see, that's a good parallel from actually playing a game. Is like the technology you're finding is essentially alien until you find out what it does. And you're like, oh, that's super useful.
Yeah, right. Or super terrible, depending on the occasion, right?
Yeah. So I think there's a few things that I think are really good about this game. I like that it emphasizes the idea of working it out in play. So there's no character creation in the game going on here. I mean, there's a little bit with the mutations, but you can pick 1 to 4 interesting mutations in like 10 minutes tops. That like a lot of it is worked out in play. And I'm fascinated by the idea that equipment effectively becomes the progress of the game and learning the environment becomes the progress of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And that might seem really strange to us when we're used to like, oh yeah, I get like these new abilities at level 5, or I get to put like 60 skill points into my combat abilities. But it's like, no, I found a plasma cannon.
Yeah, right. I'm a different person now. Now I'm the king.
But it's only got 6 shots in it. That's a whole other dynamic, right? Like you're thinking
with the battery packs.
Yeah, you're thinking about like a different game. Like, I don't know if I'm going to even find more ammo for this thing. I don't even know how it works, right? So there's this added level of complexity. And like, that's the thing, is it could break. This seems like a great game. Even though they don't have fumbles or like critical misses, this is a great game to include that, to add that level of complication. Like if you roll snake eyes, I think that should mean something in this game.
I agree.
Certainly if I was running it, I would have that be. And I don't think it'd be like serious, like, oh,
yeah,
it would. Yeah, okay, shut up. You know that. You know me too well. All right. If I was me and not me at the same time, I'd have it so that it just causes a minor malfunction.
Yeah.
And I would resist the temptation to blow people up.
Some of the time. But yeah, one of the things that this does, I think, really well is it has that feeling of discovery that a lot of games go out of their way to tell you they have.
Yeah.
But then they kind of follow these really rote patterns and arcs of progression where you don't even know the types of characters you can play until you try them, until you try and make them in this. So there's just so many elements at play that make this an exciting game. Like looking at its impact on us today, like what could you play now? Well, Jim Ward has been kind enough to make other games, so he's got follow-ups that like kind of relate to Metamorphosis Alpha, right? The two big ones.
He didn't just make this game.
Yeah, it wasn't a one-hit wonder, right? There's Gamma World, which is a huge name. For many in the role-playing, verse, they'll know Gamma World inside out, but that's another title by Jim Ward. Again, mutations and discovery, adventure, excitement, pulp themes, all of that.
I would say that Gamma World is Metamorphosis Alpha out of the bottle.
Yeah, 100%.
Right? Like, obviously you're contained on a planet, but there's more of that connection to a world we would understand as opposed to a flying building with ecosystems in it.
Yeah, that's right. And then the other Jim Ward is Mutant Crawl Classics, the offspring of DCC Dungeon Crawl Classics, which is a favorite of the show here. And that's one that I haven't given the proper time of day to yet, because I love DCC, but I haven't gone deep on, the sister game. But now that I've spent time looking at Metamorphosis Alpha and kind of understanding, like, I guess, what the fantasy is, I can see Mutant Crawl Classics having like a fresh coat of paint on it to, as an appeal of its own.
Yeah, there's certain things about MCC that change how it's played. Like there is an amazing emphasis on how equipment works. There's even, I've seen in forums people talking about using the accessibility roles for magic items. So the idea is that like you don't necessarily know how a magic item works based on how complex it is. There's a mechanic in MCC that governs complexity level, or effectively. And it acts like a difficulty curve in using the item. That's still quite mechanical, but I appreciate that. I've always thought of MCC as actually being better as a supplement to DCC if you want to play a sci-fi gonzo-esque campaign. My main reason for that is that it seems like a simplified, cut down version. No shade on it. It's a totally playable game. I would love to give some of the modules a shot. Like rules is written totally vanilla. We should definitely try that out. But for my money, if I was going to adapt this game, Metamorphosis Alpha, into modern rules, my personal recommendation is to actually use Advanced Fighting Fantasy Stellar Adventures, which is a new product that's come out, which is basically the sci-fi rule set for AFF. It'd probably take a little finagling, but I think that they would overlap really nicely because it is more of a skill-based game. And though that's not present in this, that feels like a more organic fit in a lot of ways.
Yes, I can understand what you mean. It's like that's a more logical extrapolation to today's standards.
Yeah. You'd have to figure out, because that's more for playing essentially Advanced Fighting Fantasy, but it's Star Wars or Flash Gordon.
Yeah.
So there's suggestions on how to make it more hard SF, but this game isn't, even though it's weird because I think of Brian Aldiss as being more of a hard SF writer, but this game's inspiration is kind of taking a bit of that like hard science fiction and then throwing some of that pulp and soft SF in there.
Yeah, the hard sci-fi is window dressing for the real stuff, which is all the soft, gooey sci-fi in the middle.
Which I would say the opinion of Battletech is that's the reverse. Oh, that looks like soft SF. The robots don't make sense, and then you look closer. Oh no, somebody actually thought of how that worked. Oh damn. That still doesn't make 100% sense, but it makes a lot more sense than I thought it did.
Someone counted the rivets.
I know, right? So anyway, that's Metamorphosis Alpha, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the show. We are happy to be back and making stuff again, and now I'm all moved into my new place. You know, we can proceed as normal and hopefully better than before.
We're really excited. We're going to come back next week with an episode of our Beyond the Book series. We're going to look at weapons and armor, equipment.
Which definitely inspired by this episode.
100%. Like coming off this, it just made so much sense. So we'll do a dive on that. We'll just take a look at what that means, how that plays, different games and concepts related to that. So give us a check out when that comes out in the next week or so. And as always, comment, give us your thoughts and opinions on Metamorphosis or other games as well.
Give us that engagement. We love to see it. That means the show gets out to more people. So until then, happy gaming.
Have a great one.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.